Egypt stood at its height, proud and heavy with monuments that reached for the sky as if eternity could be carved from stone. Pharaoh's palaces glittered beneath a sun that spared no one, and the great river, wide and patient, cut through the land like the line of a god's hand. Every morning, the sound of labor rose before the birds began their songs. Hammers struck, whips cracked, and songs of grief turned to silence. In the fields of brick and straw, a nation bent under the weight of another's fear. Fear had built Egypt's power, and now it ruled even Pharaoh himself. The Hebrews, once welcomed as guests, had multiplied beyond measure. What began as gratitude became suspicion, then hatred. The Pharaoh's mind turned hard like the stone he ruled over. In council, he spoke of control disguised as order, of fear disguised as wisdom. His words carried across courtyards and streets, a decree that would stain the river red long before a plague ever touched it. Every son born to the Hebrews was to die. Every daughter might live, for life without sons meant a future already strangled. Soldiers moved through alleys, their sandals grinding dust into the walls. Doors were forced open, cries muffled by the clash of metal. The Nile heard it all and kept its flow steady, as if waiting for a different kind of command. Among the Hebrews, whispers replaced laughter. The women spoke less in daylight and more in the dark, their prayers small and fierce, held between clenched teeth. Jochebed carried her fear like a constant weight inside her ribs. She had already lost friends, neighbors, cousins. She had watched soldiers leave behind silence. Yet in her arms now lay a child whose heartbeat seemed to argue against every law Egypt had ever written. The child's cry was small but sharp, and she pressed him close each time it rose. For 3 months she hid him, working while others slept, resting only when the city's noise drowned out her own. The house became a rhythm of movement and stillness. Miriam fetched water in quiet. Amram sealed cracks in the walls with clay to keep light from spilling out. Each knock at a door in the street froze them. Each shout of a soldier cut through the air like thunder. But time moves without mercy. The baby grew heavier, louder, alive. One night she sat with him in the faint light of a small flame. His breathing was steady against her shoulder. She watched his tiny fingers close around nothing and felt how fragile defiance can be. Around her, the air smelled of dust, oil, and the faint sweetness of milk. She knew she could no longer keep him hidden. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from decision. In silence, she reached for the reeds she had gathered. Each piece soaked and softened, bending easily under her fingers. The weaving began, and the house filled with the sound of small strands crossing, an act of creation in a world that had forgotten mercy. The basket took form through the night. She lined it with tar and pitch until it was dark and watertight, the smell bitter but strong. When dawn came, the sky was pale as linen and the streets still empty. Jochebed wrapped her son in a cloth she had sewn herself, one she had hoped to save for his naming day. The fabric smelled of home, of work and waiting. She pressed him to her heart and breathed in the shape of his head. Her tears did not fall yet. She had no time for grief that might draw attention. Miriam walked beside her, her small feet leaving prints in the damp earth. The river waited where papyrus grew tall, its reeds whispering against one another like people too afraid to speak aloud. Jochebed stepped into the shallow edge, water curling around her ankles, cool and alive. She set the basket down, hands shaking. For a moment she did not move. The baby stirred, his soft cry rising, and she placed her hand over him, not to silence him, but to bless him. Then she let go. The basket rocked once, twice, and the current took it. The sound of water filled the space where a mother's heartbeat had been. She turned away, walking fast, eyes on the ground. Miriam stayed hidden among the reeds, her breath catching each time the basket drifted farther. She watched it until it was no longer a shape, but a suggestion of movement, something that might have been a miracle or a mistake. The river carried it toward the gardens of Pharaoh's house, where the air smelled of perfume and jasmine, where servants walked without looking down. The water slowed near a bend, and the basket caught in a cluster of reeds just as the sound of laughter reached the shore. Pharaoh's daughter came to the river with her maidens, gold glinting at her wrists, her feet bare against the wet sand. She had grown up surrounded by command, but power had never quieted the hollow place behind her ribs. When she saw the basket, she frowned not from fear but curiosity. A servant waded in, parting reeds until the strange object was lifted free. When the lid was drawn back, a cry rose from inside, a sound raw and demanding, the kind that belongs to both life and protest. The princess stared down, and something in her changed. She saw not a foreign child, but a human one, small and helpless in a world too sharp. The baby's tears glistened like light against his cheeks. Compassion entered her before reason had time to intervene. She called for someone to nurse him, and a girl stepped forward from the shadows, Miriam, eyes wide but steady. Her voice was careful, her offer simple. A Hebrew woman could care for him until he grew. The princess nodded. The basket had found its second miracle. The child was carried back through the streets to the same mother who had released him. The payment came from the empire that had ordered his death. Jochebed took her son again, holding him as if the world had folded in on itself, and mercy had slipped through the crack. Years passed, and the palace became the child's world. The boy learned to walk on marble floors, to speak in the polished tones of royalty. He watched the Nile from windows taller than any man, and wondered why the water never seemed to stop moving. Tutors taught him history and mathematics, the names of stars, and the rituals of the gods. But the sound of hammers still reached him through the open courtyards. The songs of the laborers rose like smoke, and though he did not yet understand the words, he knew the ache behind them. He grew into strength and grace, but also questions. The man who had been drawn from the river began to feel the pull of the current again, that same restless call that asks a person to remember where they came from. He watched how Egyptians walked past Hebrews without seeing them, how commands fell like rain and mercy was rationed. The palace air grew thick with the smell of pride. Moses carried his confusion quietly, but it weighed more than armor. One day he left the palace, walking the paths where slaves carried stone and straw. The sun pressed hard against his back. Dust clung to his sandals. He stopped when he saw a man fall beneath a whip. The overseer struck again, the rhythm steady, impersonal. Moses's chest burned with something he could not name. Anger, pity, guilt, all braided together. He moved before thought could catch up. His hands found the overseer. The struggle was brief, the silence after longer. When the dust settled, the man lay still. The heat in Moses's veins turned to cold. He hid the body in the sand, pressing it flat as if the earth itself could keep a secret. But secrets breathe. The next day, two Hebrews argued, and Moses stepped between them. He spoke softly, but the words struck back. "Who made you ruler over us?" The voice cut him open. It was not an accusation. It was truth. Pharaoh's palace had made him something no one trusted. By the end of the day, word had reached the court. Pharaoh's wrath came swift. Soldiers were sent. Moses ran. He fled east, through dunes that shifted underfoot, through heat that felt alive. Nights dropped cold as iron. He drank from dry wells, ate from what the desert offered. By the time he reached Midian, his skin was cracked, his lips bleeding. The land was different, wider skies, silence that listened. A well stood at the edge of a small settlement, and there he rested. Shepherds came, loud and impatient, pushing women away from the water. Moses rose without speaking. The shepherds saw something in his stance, something old, and stepped back. The women drew water and left quickly, glancing back once. Later, They told their father of the stranger. The old man called him to share bread. That meal became the beginning of peace. Days became months. He worked, herding flocks across stony slopes, finding grass in places that looked barren. His hands, once soft with palace oil, grew strong again. Zipporah moved through the camp with quiet certainty, and their paths crossed often enough that silence began to mean something else. Jethro watched, seeing in Moses the calm that comes only after fire has burned everything else away. Moses learned the desert's language, the sound of wind through rocks, the smell of rain long before it came, the patience of slow living. But sometimes, when the stars leaned close, he saw the Nile in his dreams. He heard his mother's whisper, the soft slap of water against reeds, the cry that had once saved him. He would wake with tears on his face, the night air cold and bright. The past had not gone. It had only changed its shape. The story closes here on a man between worlds. Once a child of slaves, once a son of Pharaoh, now a shepherd who listens more than he speaks. The river that carried him out of danger now runs inside him, its current unseen but certain. Soon the desert will light a flame, and the quiet he has built will turn to calling. But not yet. For now, the man drawn from the water learns the last lesson of stillness, the kind that prepares a soul for the voice that will come from fire.